Well, I'm Stephen Reigns, and I've studied Nin intensely for over 20 years, and I'm with Tristine Rainer, who was a friend of Nin. Also, Anais wrote the preface to Tristine's first book, and Tristine was actually around during the time that this unexpurgated diary took place.
Oh no, I'm not that old.
Oh, no. Wait, towards the end of the relationship, yeah.
This is 1947 to 1955. I did exist.
Yeah.
But I was 3 years old. So,
Wait.
so we hadn't gotten into any exciting trouble by that time.
Yeah, sorry, I apologize. So Anais Nin, for those who do not know, she had a 30-year bi-coastal life that involved having husbands on both coasts. And so I always think of Tristine as part of Nin's underground community that helped make that happen.
Right. But let me clarify. Trapeze is the diary that covers the period from the time that Anais met Rupert Pole, the man who became her husband, in 1955. So this was really before I met Anais, and I met Anais in 1962. And by that time, she had been married to Rupert and to Hugo for 7 years. So the marriage itself, the bigamy, which is so unusual for a woman, was a 20-year period. But basically, they were living together as man and wife during the period of this book because Rupert was a forest ranger up in Angeles Crest Forest here in Sierra Madre. And because the Forestry Service was so strict, they didn't allow unmarried couples to live together. And so Anais was always about disguises and lies. I think we learned from this book how much she enjoyed that. That it wasn't just that she got trapped into it by accident. I think she may have sought it. So they pretended they were married for the Forestry Service during this time. And then later they pretended, after she published the first of the diaries, that they were not married, so she could appear as a single woman, which is how she presented herself in the diaries. So it's one of the things that is fascinating about Anais is the labyrinth of her lies, that you clear up one and there's another one underneath it and another one underneath that.
Yeah. And in this, and for that reason, at this time in her life, she was not keeping a traditional diary that we might think about in terms of just a bound diary. She kept a diary on loose leaf paper that she would hide in different places in both residencies. Also, Paul Heron, who edited Trapeze, would go through and include letters that she wrote to friends and that friends wrote to her to kind of fill in the gaps of this diary. So though we might be familiar with Nin as a diary writer, writing every single day in the diary, at this point in her life she wasn't doing that as often. And to really compile this story required the voice of others. And so that's what you have in this book, as well as Nin kept a meticulous calendar. And so certain dates in this new volume have what Nin was doing that day. So she'll talk about appointments she went to or what was going on, just to help kind of fill in those gaps. But also, so how many people here have read this book? Oh, great. So a handful. And it's a challenge to make a diary readable, to have a narrative arc to it, and yet this happens, and it's not an easy task. Do you want to talk about the task of
Making a narrative arc to
Yeah.
the diary? Well, one doesn't do that. you discover it in rereading it. And those of you who have kept diaries, it's one of the joys is that when you go back and read, you actually see that there is the structure of story within it. And you discover, as Anais said, we each are a book, there's a plot for each person, and that's the self-knowledge and reflection that I think you can't get any other way but I want to correct you about something.
Sure.
Anais didn't write every day, even when she wrote a journal. She came out of, Anais did not, is this working?
Yes.
Okay. Did not write every day. In fact, she felt that you would lose the natural rhythms of the diary if you forced yourself to. That's actually an American discipline that comes out of the Puritan tradition of diary writing. And Anais comes out of the journal intime, which is the French tradition of journal writing, which it was one of the things she taught me, and that I felt it was important to pass on, that you don't have to write every day as a discipline. You write when your heart needs to, when you need to, when you want to, when the words are flowing out of you. It's unlike any other kind of writing she prioritized spontaneity. And so she modernized, all of the kind of journal writing that happens now and that happens online with online journals, it all is thanks to Anais, in a way, liberating the journal, just as she tried to liberate women. She tried to, for Americans, liberate this form of writing. Sorry to contradict. We're good friends. I can do it.
I don't regret that age comment now. No, I'm only teasing. But as someone who is friends with Nin, I have to say, so the material here I was quite familiar with, and the one thing that surprised me in the entire volume, and maybe you could talk about this, and those who are familiar with Nin, she was so beautiful in any image, she's so captivating in it, but what surprised me the most is she wore blue jeans. In the book itself, it said blue jeans. I was like, wow, that's a Nin I was not familiar with.
Me neither. I never saw her in blue jeans, and in fact, she railed against blue jeans. But this was still at the stage where she was trying to please Rupert. She was really in love with this young man who was 16 years younger than she. And she was worried. In this volume, you see that she's very jealous when he flirts with younger women. So she was trying to be the forest ranger's wife, and she hated it. In fact, I took some notes, because I think what's unusual is that you don't usually think of Anais as having a sense of humor. But she did. It was just extremely dry. It was so dry it was desiccated. And you didn't know in person, you knew she was making a joke, because she would always precede it with a little laugh. And then she would tell what she considered a joke. So I think it's funny here, the things that she says about America and Los Angeles, which at first she hated, and then she ultimately chose. But here she loved Rupert because she loved the sex. But no, it's very clear. And I think that's one of the things that's remarkable about Anais, is that she, until that time, that's my friend. Oh, you'll hear about it later. She was, until that time in the 1950s, when she was writing here, women married to better themselves. They married for security. They married because to be an old maid was shameful. The idea of marrying a man because he was your best lover, of looking for that, of prioritizing that, nobody had done that. Nobody had written about that. And I think of Anais, I think of her as coming out for women. I think she was coming out for heterosexual women and really hasn't gotten credit for that. But she was saying, this is what a woman's sexuality is. It's not always receptive. It is also can be active, and she can choose what she wants, and she has as much desire as a man. And that was the first time really a woman had said that. Men were always telling you about women's sexuality, but she was coming out and telling you about her own and then saying, I speak for other women too. And
but what we have in this volume is we have a lot of her doubt, and also there are some really transparent passages that Nin's need for reassurance is very strong, so much so that like a lot of compliments that were given to her were written down and recorded. And for someone who was having two different husbands, her jealousy over both husbands is very apparent. Not only for Rupert, where she gets upset with him in several scenes in Trapeze, she gets upset that, and especially that the women were younger, but she would get upset that the flirtation happened in front of her. And she would say, to have the flirtation happen when I'm not there. There's another passage with Hugo, where she hears that Hugo, her husband in New York, had sex with a woman who I think was startled by him, but Anais makes these cutting remarks, and she tells herself, it's so nice that Hugo could be animalistic with someone else. That you find her kind of working out her emotions on the page, trying to reassure herself that she's not losing these men by their flirtations with others.
Right. So I found the page where I consider this her desiccated humor. So she's talking about foresters, and she's living with Rupert, the forest ranger. The choice combination of foresters, this is a party, a group, in parentheses, another subhuman form. And then she later says, so the short, the lyrical, the intensely heightened moments of passion are isolated by a life altogether colorless, meaningless, and limited, having no integration or connection with the nights. And she then rails against America. That's against foresters. Then America, which she had actually grown up in New York, but she always pretended she was French. And okay. It is what made Americans autistic, subhuman, unable to relate to other human beings, inarticulate. In the movies, I am aware that people are becoming more and more intellectually atrophied, and that the movies and television provide them with baby food. No need to masticate, no need to carve, no need to read a book with effort. And she goes on about, she calls Americans zombies, she rails against the bourgeois life that she finds, she rails particularly about Sierra Madre, and you're finding this all the way through, but here's what's remarkable about Anais, and why I love her, and why I think she's worth revisiting. She works on herself, and especially during this volume, She's in analysis with Ing Wagner, who was her psychiatrist in New York. And Wagner really got her to take responsibility, so that after all of these negative things, she says, this is so kind of wonderful I'm going to page 328, so we're near the end of it. And, you have to give Paul credit. He is a very good editor. Okay, so it's not 328. Oh, here it is. I'm working with Wagner on my hatred of America, prodding its origins. My earliest memory of France is of sociability. I invited everyone on the street for tea. America first appeared in my eyes as my father saw it. He never accepted a concert tour in America. He said the greatest two catastrophes in the world were the birth of Christ and the discovery of America. This is this terrifying father of hers. He had a prejudice, said Wagner, and Anais answered her, he did. And since he did not know America or know English, how much his caricature of America stemmed from his antagonisms towards my mother, I don't know. And she goes on and talks about that. I inherited completely my father's prejudice. I arrived with a fear of losing my soul in a materialistic civilization. My diary was at once a refuge, a home, a shelter. And the psychiatrist says when you have a prejudice, you proceed to pick up proofs to strengthen your original premise. You proceeded to accumulate proofs of America's hatefulness, but the anger was already there. And Anais says, since I persist in generalities, persist in accusing America, I want to look at what I hate, which was, as you say, a projection of my own feeling. Today I added systematically what I hate. America is cold, undemonstrative, inhuman, incapable of relationship. It is rough, uncouth, and full of hostilities. One by one, she's now writing, I am willing to question. And she says the paradox is that the one who is truly to blame for having come to America is my father, because her father abandoned the family. The family had to find a way of surviving, and eventually, so they moved to the United States. But this is the honesty that Nin always goes deeper and deeper in the diary. And that was her advice in writing a journal. Always ask what's underneath. What also do I feel? What am I not saying? And she does that herself in her writing. And so after all this railing against the United States, she admits, that's my prejudice. I'm bringing that feeling. And indeed, she came to love California, Los Angeles, and particularly Silver Lake, where Rupert, after also railing that she didn't want a house, she didn't want roots, she discovered that she loved having a house that had a view of Silver Lake, and it made her realize that she was actually happy with Rupert. And one of the things that my book tracks is she ultimately chose Rupert. She, after all those years of not being able to decide which man she wanted to be with and going back and forth on this trapeze, she realized she was happy with Rupert. And the building of the house in Silver Lake and living in Silver Lake had a lot to do with it. She came to realize she loved the sunshine here. She found a community of artists here, and she created a life for her. And that was also her message, that you can create the life you want. It doesn't have to be given to you as Paris was given to her.
Yeah, and she found the community here definitely more accepting than the community in New York. She also, I know she had a residency on Silver Lake Boulevard for a time as well, in an apartment complex there. And so in this book, the house isn't there yet in the book, but
yeah, they're living in that awful little cabin in Sierra Madre, with its ugly brown walls.
And that she was expected to clean. So
yes.
When talking about these different lifestyles, so you have Rupert in Sierra Madre who is upset at the suggestion of a house cleaner. And then you have Rupert in New York, where the house, the maid comes in and makes breakfast and serves it to Anais.
No, the other way around. Hugo
in New York, where they have a maid who is like propping up pillows.
Yes, they always have breakfast on a tray.
Yeah. And so she was living these very different lives. There's record of her going to a seamstress in New York, but yet in Sierra Madre she's darning Rupert's socks.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, and their arguments about, please, Rupert, can we get a housekeeper? And she thought both husbands were cheap. And that's a theme here. But she was in that terrible position of being a woman who was financially dependent, not on one husband, but on two. And she came to realize, and we see this in this volume, this is really before Betty Friedan. You are seeing her coming to the realization about how entrapped and infantilized women are by not making their own living, by not being able to, and being dependent on men like a child for survival. And she's yearning to be able to make a living herself. She realizes here that's the only way she's going to be free. The interesting thing is, she did. When she published the diaries in 1966, she finally became a bestseller, the first diary of her years in Paris with Henry Miller. And she had money then, and there was money coming in. And by that time, Hugo had no money. He'd wasted all of his income. He was financially dependent on her. And Rupert quit his job. He'd become a school teacher by that time to help be a support to her. And she was the support for both the husbands. She never divorced Hugo, even though she primarily lived then with Rupert. And they both were very accommodating because they were now dependent on her financially. So if you track the money, it's one of the really interesting things in Anais's life. And it's extremely important. She became very happy later in life. And I think that having succeeded as a writer and having her own income was a big part of it. And being able then to really make independent choices, free choices.
And one thing that, it's so scandalous that she was a bigamist and had two husbands. And the question is, how could one emotionally do that? And reading passages in Trapeze, it is kind of, you could see how it's not actually that she's justifying it to herself, but she really is a woman torn and feeling that she's on a trapeze, which, we know trapeze, that's at the circus, right? And her life at that time was kind of a circus, and the climate at the time for women was quite a circus. And here you have someone who's getting different needs met by both men. And, before that happiness that Tristine is talking about, you're reading about a lot of the uncomfortable feelings, a lot of the feelings of rejection, and how publishers were not interested in her work. At one point in time, Hugo is paying a publisher to help publish her work, and that publisher kind of squanders the money. So in it, and it's also interesting how she would continually say that in the diary she wrote a complete portrait of someone, which sounds quite lovely. But then to actually recognize what a complete portrait is that she's also saying negative things about people in the diary. So a lot of the passages open up. It feels expected at some point that there's a lament about Rupert as she was leaving him and going to Hugo, and that she really is a woman torn, and there's a great level of dissatisfaction with both men, as well as a level of satisfaction with them. And I think Paul did a great job of kind of bringing that out in the work.
And also compassion, though. She really couldn't bear to hurt either one. With Hugo, she felt that he had saved her from a life of poverty. He had given her a wonderful life. He was a banker. He was in Paris. He enlarged her life so much. And he was very protective and really loving to her. And she was so grateful that a lot of it was guilt. She just could not leave him for a younger man because she felt so guilty and so indebted to him. And I think that was genuine. And she was bound to Rupert by the passion that she had looked for, and she knew she was not going to find a man who could meet her passion as he did. She'd certainly experimented enough to find it. So when she finally did, she knew what she had. And so she could never leave him for that reason. And she was caught. And she really did love two men at the same time. And if any of you have ever been in that situation, it's agonizing. And I think that agony comes out in this volume. But she also, what comes out here, and I've never seen it except in my knowing her, but I've never seen it in the diaries or anything written about her, is she was a prankster. She was mischievous. She was certainly aware that in naming it the trapeze, there was an element of enjoyment of it. And the prankster stuff I thought was interesting is she's experimenting with ideas already about how to present the diary, which was to get it published. So she thinks about, she has a friend who's going to publish it in South America under her name, and it won't be associated with Anais. Then she thinks about a pseudonym. Then she thinks about, with some friends, I'll publish it as if it's fiction and just say that the whole thing is a fictional work, a fictional diary. So she's rehearsing how to get this published because she knows she can't present it as the truth because she's married to Hugo all the way through it. So when she finally publishes the diary, Hugo's not there. She presents herself very strategically. And this was, sort of a prank too. As if she is a single independent woman, unmarried, and it was perfect for 1966 because my generation of women, that's what we wanted. We wanted to have free, independent lives where we had lovers that we chose, and she fulfilled that image, even though she never lived it. She presented herself as if she lived it by eliminating any husbands from the diaries. And when women feminists found out that she'd lied about that, they were very angry. And that had a lot to do with Anais's reputation plummeting at the end of her life and after her death.
You had a question?
Yes, I'm wondering if there's any mention in this volume or your awareness, since you knew her, of her relationship with James V. O'Hurley, who also lived in Silver Lake.
Oh, yes. It's always, her love for Herlihy is all the way through this book. And even she's so grateful that there is not a sexual dynamic as there had been with Gore, because she really wanted the relationship with Jim to be not contaminated. He was so supportive of her writing, and she of his. I hadn't realized that he'd been a student of hers. She taught a course, and that's how they first met. Because when I met Jim, and Anais would have parties up at the Silver Lake House, and Jim would always be there. And he was very protective of her. He did not like Rupert. The two of them really clashed. And it became when Anais became ill, she had cancer, and Rupert took very good care of her during that time. But he and Jim really fought over her. And Jim was the one who got these pills from Japan for her, and they each thought they knew better how to take care of her. And Anais was somebody that people fought over a lot. I mean, it's still true that people think because she touches you inside, because of her great intimacy with herself in her writing, you feel when you read her that she's speaking for you and to you, and you have, even if you never met her, you feel a very special relationship with her. And I think that becomes a kind of possessiveness that in life people had over her too.
And James even, they had so there are correspondences throughout the book, and they refer to each other as like my twinship. And at one point in time, James is living with Hugo in New York and essentially just kind of acting like a spy almost, of relaying details of what Hugo is doing. And it's something that when you're calling Anais the prankster, you could see like both of them are kind of getting a charge out of this. And but Herlihy's letters to Nin are nothing but flattering and supportive, and I think really offered her, at this time of great doubt in her life and insecurity, offered her a support. And you could understand why she would want to kind of merge with this like twinship person that he was at the time.
She called him her spiritual cousin as well.
Yeah.
I've got a question, and I wondered what your opinion was on this. So you can tell that living here and being with Rupert, she was very much in love, and her health seemed to be, before she had the cancer, obviously, her health was good, But what interests me was, and I wondered if you picked up on this, what interests me was she actually finally let go of as far as her art was concerned, because as an artist myself, you're always trying to, I want to do this, I want to do that. And she kind of, because she was so happy here, she almost like she let go of it. And
of her work, her art.
Yeah, and it started to flow, and things then started to happen. And that's the impression I got, and I wondered what you two thought about that.
I actually think she stopped writing once she was happy with Rupert. Mm-hmm. I mean, you don't find the last of the novels is Collage. Now, she was with Rupert in Sierra Madre when she wrote Collage. But once the diary was published in '66, she wrote essays, she wrote correspondence with her fans, but she didn't do any more creative work. Mm-hmm. And even the journal, even the diary, she doesn't keep.
But it's kind of what I thought was interesting, that even though she might not have written but it's like the rest of the world suddenly caught up with her. Do you know what I mean?
Her timing, she was fortunate because the women's movement happened in the 60s. At the time that her first diary was published. And it was presented as, this is the voice, the real voice of a woman in her diary. It's undisguised. So that, at the time, I was in a women's consciousness group, and I was at UCLA, and I taught the first women's studies in literature class there. And so Anais was on my syllabus, and that was perfect for her because women were discovering other women writers. At that time, it's hard to believe, there was not a woman on any English literature syllabus other than Emily Dickinson. There just weren't any, and suddenly we were discovering there were a lot of women writers out there. And so Anais got discovered. It was great timing. It was the perfect zeitgeist. That made her very happy because, as you get in this volume as well, she really believed in herself as a writer. She felt that she had a unique voice and something important to say, but nobody in the United States or anywhere really agreed.
I'm laughing at that comment. There is a correspondence of Nin writing to a critic who reviewed her work. And for anyone who's ever received a negative review of anything artistic that they've done, it's quite comical how Nin is essentially like belittling and attacking the reviewer.
Oh, she never let a bad review go without answering it and belittling the reviewer in return.
Yeah. So when talking about that confidence, I mean, though there are a lot of moments of insecurity in the book, there are also those moments where you kind of see her in action. You can see how there was something propelling her forward, this deep belief in herself. There was another hand. Did someone else have their hand raised? Good question. Is there anything else that stands out to you that you might want to talk about, or?
Well, at one point, we were talking about the guilt. She writes about her having a fantasy of finding another woman for Hugo in New York. That would, if she keeps the arc of Anais in this book is from guilt to taking responsibility, which frees her from guilt. And she does that with, as I tried to track for you about America, she also does it in terms of Hugo, where she feels guilty, and finally she gets to the point where she takes responsibility. She says, I keep trying to get Hugo to leave me. I keep trying to want him to find somebody else and reject me. That's out of my guilt, so I don't want to take responsibility for that. But she then, because of the diary writing, which is so self-reflective, if you write and you're putting things down there and then you reread it, you're going to see, oh, that's what I'm doing, because you can see it with some objectivity. So it's very much like having a therapist, and it's great. You can tell I'm a huge advocate for journal writing, and especially as an adjunct to therapy. It is a way of healing yourself and maturing. And she used it in both ways. And you can see that at work in this volume in terms of her taking responsibility for the relationship and for her ambivalence and not putting it first. It's oh, I've got to get away from Hugo because he's so petty and he's always he's really sort of an amateur, And I have to get back to Rupert, who's authentic and a man of the earth. Then she gets there and she says, I have to get away from Rupert. It's so boring here, and he's so boring, and he never reads anything other than Newsweek magazine, and so she'll fly back. And by the end, she's admitting, you know, I don't really have to be blaming them. All of this is coming from me. I'm making this happen.
One last question.
Yes, one reason my wife isn't here is because she's a feminist who was in the group you mentioned earlier, who became disillusioned with Anais Nin and still bears under the grudge. So if I could speak for her, one question she would probably ask is, an elephant in the room is her incest with her father.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
I would like to say something too. So I think why this volume is so valuable is you could see that what she's doing with each husband is a microcosm of what she's going to do later on with the publication of the diary. How she's having these two lives, and like that secret keeping is going to keep her safe in some way, or it's going to be for her benefit. And you could see that with the diary as well. I mean, there is it's talked about that Hugo didn't want to be in the diary. And I don't know if that's necessarily true or if that's something that she created or said. But it's actually in the preface to the first published diary, is that a husband's omitted. And that's a detail that...
No, it wasn't original.
It wasn't?
No.
Oh, okay.
They must have done that later.
So that's it. And then when talking about the incest, I think that... like how does that shape someone's life experience? Like an early abandonment, as a child. And so you can see why she had such an insecure attachment, and that she had to have like two different men, and not only with those two men, that she had other lovers at the same time, and how she would sexualize experiences, even talking in the book about trying to have sex with one of her best friend's sons, who was of age, it sounds like, in the book. But you could see how this, that kind of experience really kind of shaped her. And it's unfortunate that sometimes eclipses her her legacy. It's, of course, fascinating, but it's also...
Well, the flip side of this is a cousin of mine who's in her 40s, woman, says that she's definitely making a comeback today. I think you spoke to them as well. But among the younger generation, they're tapping into some of the feminist elements that you were speaking earlier.
Yeah.
So she's going through a revival. I think that your book is well placed.
All right. And the incest, I don't think anybody knows whether there was any actual incest in her childhood. Her father she later thought he was schizophrenic. Her father was a really awful man, and completely narcissistic and selfish. And certainly there was violation of boundaries. Anais had a huge problem. She had no boundaries. Later, and it's something I explore in my book, is the incest. She has no boundaries?
Yeah, I mean,
she's
having two different lives. How is that? That sounds like incredible boundary and limitation imposed on oneself and both those men.
No, but boundaries, say in friendships, like with Herlihy, twinship. She did the same thing with me, and the sexualizing of almost every relationship. Every relationship was a flirtation. Every relationship was a seduction. So that is the kind of boundaries I'm talking about. certainly she created boundaries about what she was going to reveal to you, and deciding who she was going to tell what to when she would get confused, who knew what. But the adult incest was a trauma. And I don't want to give away, really it's the ending of my book, which I come to understand, I think, what really went on there. For me, when I was writing my book, it was interesting to me that there were one of two things that made people upset about Anais. One of them was the bigamy, that she lied, that she was such a liar. That was certainly what bothered Henry Miller and Gore Vidal. They knew what a liar she was, and they judged her for that. For other people, including myself, it was when I learned about the incest. And I learned about it from her best friend, Renata. And we never discussed it per se, although I did talk with Renata about it. I think it's a Rorschach test, which bothers you more. And so I could not identify with the incest. I could identify with the bigamy. That seemed like a good idea to me, because my father had abandoned me, and I could understand always wanting to have a spare husband. But not the incest. I couldn't identify with that. Other people can understand the incest. Maybe they have more experience and they understand how one is victimized, even as an adult, by the feelings towards a father and the need to get the father's love. And so it's, in approaching the question, it's a good thing to look inside about why you react the way you do, which was Anais's key. Always look inside. We see things as we are.
I mean, again, I don't want to give too much away about your book, but it's a good book. But you touched on something very interesting, which was where her background, not just from like a father, like the emotional father, but she was from the whole Surrealism. And Surrealism was always about pushing,
breaking boundaries,
transgressing. And she was with Artaud, who was like very, very strong on those back, So I'm not saying that she didn't do it, or the emotional impact, but she was from that whole art culture where that's what you did. And she was at that age, she was in her 20s, where she was very impressionable, 20s, and so it was kind of, And Henry Miller was big on the transgression. There was like a few. So if you look at it, with your question, if you look and you read about the surrealists, then you'll get a little bit more of a balance. I'm not taking away what happened to her.
It was also a very absent father. So this is just as if, one might meet a man who's, I can't remember the age difference, but just like essentially her having
It's only like 20 years difference.
Yeah, 20-year difference.
And her husband was 16 years difference.
Yeah, so it wasn't as if, one might imagine, their own family and like the man you grew up with in your house. She didn't have that. She actually, they were continents apart. So it was, part of it was the seduction that both of them were doing at the time. So.
But I think you make a great point, Colette, about her primary artistic influence was the Surrealists in the 30s in Paris. And so the prankster aspect, which is part of Surrealism, became part of her. The Surrealist novels that she wrote, which don't care at all about plot, don't have story, don't really have characters. They are difficult to read unless you accept the surrealist premise. Her breaking of boundaries in so many ways was a surrealist ideal. And the love of dreams, the interest in dreams, and the imagination. She brought surrealism to the United States, and she was always an advocate of it. And I think if you fell in love with Anais, through her, you discovered surrealism, and for women in the 60s, she brought it back. And, I taught a class on surrealist art and film at UCLA Extension in it was like 1971 or something like that. And we looked at those early surrealist films. Well, right after people became aware of those early surrealist films, we had MTV videos. And they were the same thing. They were little surrealist films. I don't know if anybody had ever made that connection, but yeah, you did.
How come you don't like that 1920s film and you like this one?
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight to find out a bit more about Anais, especially since she's such a figure in Silver Lake, having spent the last part of her life here. And Skylight Books is kind enough to be selling Trapeze as well as Tristine's new book. And thank you all for coming out. Thanks.